Okie dokie. So last week we talked about how to take our thesis statements, our truisms, and create thesis statements out of them so that we can set ourselves up for a good literary analysis, an analysis that is focused and driven by that truism, but then also lists the reasons that we're going to use as evidence to support that. Today, we're going to talk about our body paragraphs, and we're going to use a method called smell, which I hope is something that you guys will be able to remember because we start all of this process with snots. So if we've snotted well enough in our text and we know what we're talking about through our Socratic seminar discussion piece, then we can take all of those snots and, for lack of a better metaphor, we can blow them out on the page and now be able to smell exactly what it is that we are getting at in our analysis. So I'm sorry that that's gross, but maybe it will stick with you. All right, so we do start with our snots. And from snots, we come up with these TQEs. These are just thoughts, questions, epiphanies, things that lead to those big ideas. And once we have a set of big ideas, then we're able to take those big ideas and create a truism. Then from the truism, we get the thesis statement. The thesis statement is that driving piece of the essay. It's the most important sentence in the essay. It needs to be in the introduction of the essay. Really, you can't have any kind of essay without one. And then from there, we're going to take it to kernel essays. So what is a kernel essay? Essentially, it's just a structure for organizing your essay. This comes from a lady in San Antonio who it's just breaking the essay down into pieces. So think of it when she says kernel, she's talking about like a popcorn kernel. So it's not yet popcorn. We haven't developed it into popcorn yet. It's just the little kernel. So we're going to start by putting each reason in a box. So these are our kernels. All right. So if I start with the thesis statement, throughout tests by Theodore Thomas, the system manipulates through belief in a crash, in a test, and in a choice. Then I break those three reasons down into my kernels. My crash is a kernel, test is a kernel, and choice is a kernel. And I give them their own box on the paper during my brainstorming. Does that make sense? Pause now if you need to write any of that down, or if you need to email me with some questions. All right, so then once we have our kernels, we've got crash, we've got test, we've got choice. These are essentially our reasons, right, that we believe this. Then we're going to smell each of these. And smell stands for sender, message, evidence, literary devices, and logic. Now, in the case of our literary analysis, our sender is always our author. So many of us got focused before on the topic, or we threw it out to the reader and we wanted to use you. You think this and you think that. But the sender is actually the author. The M, the message, is the message that author is sending through that kernel or that reason. Evidence is always a quote. Literary devices are those things we're taking notes over, the characterization, the setting, the point of view, plus others that you may already know that we'll get to later. Things like symbolism, illusion, imagery, similes, metaphors, all of those figurative language pieces. So any of those, irony, things like that you may know about already, if you can find them, those are free game to use here as well. And then L stands for logic. Okay, so on this next page, what you'll see is a breakdown of what that looks like. So if I were then to take my little kernel crash and expand it into the piece of popcorn, then I would start with my S, my sender. So I would say within the first few paragraphs of test, the author concocts. So I've labeled who my sender is. And then I have to give the message. So what is the message of this kernel? Okay. So the author concocts An elaborate car crash with many phases to manipulate the beliefs of the main character, Robert Proctor. Okay, so my message is that this kernel, this crash, ties back to my truism. And my truism is that we're manipulating with beliefs, right? So I've got my author, I've got my message. Then I have to give my evidence that involves a quote. Now remember, quotes cannot be sentences by themselves. They have to be inside a sentence. So we either need to introduce them, or we can start the sentence with the quote and lead out of them at the end. On this one, I decided to introduce it. I said the first phase of the crash begins with Robert fighting the steering wheel to keep the car on a straight path. It isn't until the crash spun him further into the left-hand lane. It isn't long until the crash spun him further into the left-hand lane. The crash ends with him staring into the face of the sleeping girl. So I've used 3 different quotes here to just point my finger at the place in the text that I want to focus. Okay, I didn't summarize it. I'm pulling exactly what it is from the text that I want you to look at. Then I bring in my literary devices. I say this setting is, and then I also later on, you can see kind of in the same color, mood foreshadows. That's another literary device. And then towards the bottom there, the imagery. I have 3 literary devices there that I'm going to bring up. And then my last L is logic. This is my explanation, essentially, of why I've chosen all of this. Okay. So the setting is a believable one for the character because it is a believable one for the reader. The intense mood foreshadows the end result of the crash, what the reader thinks is Robert's imminent death. And the imagery is so vivid that the character, and therefore the reader, both believe that the crash is real. This is exactly how the author manipulates belief. Now notice, at the end of this paragraph, I tied it back to the truism. Again, I constantly want to be moving everything back to that thesis statement. Okay? So this is all about the crash. I've got my sender, my message, my evidence, my literary devices, and my logic. That is one paragraph. My next paragraph, I would smell it too. So this one is for my kernel test. I'm going to pull the things about the test that he goes through to help support my smell. Okay. So this time I say the author next twists the plot to reveal that the character is being manipulated by a simulation. He has been hypnotized during a driving test to believe that the crash was real. This first becomes evident when a strange man in uniform tells Robert, "You just took the last part of your driver's test." That same man goes on to state that this type of test makes drivers more careful for the rest of their lives. Not only is Robert being manipulated, but by introducing this new setting, the author is also manipulating the reader. What was once thought of as a tragic accident or incident is now a grand relief. No one died. The crash has now become symbolic of the driving test. It adds to the author's intent. The government is apparently using this type of manipulation on everyone who takes a driver's test. And that would be my second paragraph. And then I would continue with my third kernel choice to come up with a third paragraph, which includes all of my smell. Now, I do not have to smell in order. As long as I have all of the components of smell in my paragraph, then I have a well-rounded, persuasive paragraph that supports my thesis.